I am Chiara Longoni. I'm assistant professor of marketing at Questrom. I joined Questrom 5 years ago now. And my area of expertise and what I try to do with my research is to leverage AI to maximize human well-being. So the well-being of individuals, of communities, of societies. And I do so from the lens of behavioral science. So typically, not always, but typically that means finding ways to understand the barriers for uptake of AI in those areas, or for those people that will benefit from adopting AI. And I suspect that's the reason why I'm here today.
My name is Carey Morewedge. I'm a professor of marketing and an Everett W. Lord Distinguished Faculty Scholar at Questrom School of Business at Boston University. My research studies the causes, consequences, and correction of bias in judgment and decision-making. And I'm particularly interested in how those kinds of psychological biases influence how consumers see value in the experiences and products and services that they consume, and also how those biases influence their adoption of new kinds of technology like artificial intelligence.
So we have two separate projects that are published. We have others in the works, but today we will focus on these two. And what these two projects identify are two distinct drivers or reasons why people tend to avoid AI. So one of them is what we call a fear of uniqueness neglect. And let me flesh out what we mean by that. So what we found is that people hold these two competing beliefs. So on the one hand, people believe that their circumstances, that their condition, and that includes their medical condition, are unique. They're special and they're different from those of others or those of an average person. And then on the other hand, people also hold the belief that AI is incapable and inadequate to account and to be able to recognize a person's uniqueness. So on the one hand, people believe that they are special and unique, and on the other hand, they believe that AI is unfit and unsuitable to recognize that. And because of this mismatch between these two beliefs, people tend to reject AI. And another thing that I would like to notice, which is important to notice, is that this is a parsimonious explanation that has predictive power even when other explanations are taken into account. So obviously, people's responses to AI are varied, and they might be explained by a number of reasons and a number of causes. And so the approach that we take is kind of like, we try to isolate and test one explanation that remains true in terms of its predicting power, in predicting likelihood of choice or real preference, when taking into account other explanations, such as the cost of the procedure, or the timeline of the procedure, or the convenience of the procedure, and so forth. So this is one of the two obstacles that for AI to be adopted in societies and by individuals, healthcare professionals will need to overcome.
And it's really ironic, because if you think about some of the strengths of AI, it's the incredible personalization and sort of the deep dive it can do into looking at all of your data. And so it's as if people believe other humans are much more capable of that kind of depth of understanding and analysis. And we see that sort of benevolence towards humans expressed in our second project, where we're looking at how the perception that AI is a black box is inhibiting its uptake. So many people feel like they don't understand AI, and they're right. In many cases, even the people who are writing these kinds of programs and the doctors who are using them have very little understanding into the process by which input, like a photograph of a mole or a patient's health record, is translated into some kind of diagnosis. And so that process is opaque to the programmers, it's opaque to the physicians, the healthcare practitioners, and it's opaque to patients. And that kind of opacity, that lack of transparency, makes patients hesitant to use these kinds of services, even if they're fairly accurate, right? If you're home during COVID and you don't know if you have a malignant mole on your arm, taking a photograph and using an app is going to provide you with some kind of diagnosis or some kind of indication about whether or not you should take that risk to go see a dermatologist is better than sitting at home doing nothing, right? But what we find is that people not only are right in the fact that these kinds of processes are a black box, and we do see that that kind of process, the perception of that as being opaque, inhibits their acceptance of using an AI-based medical service. But we also see that people overestimate how well they understand how human doctors make decisions. So because they're going to see a human doctor, they feel like they have some kind of insight into the process by which that human doctor is making the medical decision, right? So it's another person, it must be like, I must have some kind of understanding. It's kind of like a Monday morning quarterbacking of their doctor, right? And so that kind of perception leads them to feel like they better understand how another human is going to make the medical decision than a comparable AI, even if they are similar in terms of their performance. What's really interesting though, is that people are basically a chance in their understanding of how a human medical provider makes a decision or how an AI makes a decision. So if we give people a quiz about how a dermatologist decides whether or not a mole is cancerous or not, or how an AI-based skin software is making the same kind of decision, people are at chance accuracy for both the human and the AI provider. But people subjectively feel like they understand how the other person is making that choice. And that kind of subjective feeling of understanding is leading them to favor these kinds of human providers over AI when they're comparable in terms of their performance. And what's fortunate is that that's not something that we can't address. So we can make interventions where we explain how AI makes these kinds of decisions, and giving people some understanding of that process of opening up that black box, reducing the opacity and allowing some kind of transparency seems to raise their, at least their faith a little bit in it, in the sense that we do see an increased uptake and an increased interest in using medical AI for the kinds of things that we would see in app-based dermatology scan.
Very much integral to what we do. So on the one hand, we have this intellectual curiosity towards understanding the psychology of AI, but that is never, and from my perspective, should never be divorced from like figuring out the ways to remove these barriers, especially conditioned on, having established that adoption of AI is beneficial to people or to a particular community. So Carey mentioned one of the interventions, which is, as you can imagine, these interventions need to operate at the level of where the barrier stems from. So, one of the reasons that I was mentioning that is behind the resistance towards adopting AI is this fear of uniqueness neglect. So the fear that AI is going to be able to account and take into consideration a person's uniqueness. So an intervention that would dispel this misconception should very much try and correct it. And so what we found to be effective is interventions that are able to explain to people that actually AI is very much capable to take into account their personal circumstances. And so we test various ways to render that to people, either via the information that you give about these services. And what we found is that once these interventions are enacted and implemented, people become indifferent between an AI provider and a human provider. And I think that's really interesting because we are still not able to actually make people fully embrace AI or even prefer AI over a human provider, but at least within the preview and the context of the studies and the populations that we tested, what we are able to do is just to bring them to a point of indifference. So we are not able to actually make them fully embrace AI, but at least we are able to make them indifferent between a human and an AI provider.
In our transparency work, an interesting aspect of that is that we tested, when we tried to do interventions to explain how AI works, we did 2 experiments. And in one experiment, we explained how human practitioners make the decision. And they usually follow this decision tree that has 4 different kinds of variables that they look at. And so what we explained to people was each of the different kinds of variables and how the doctor worked through it. But we also told them that that was how the AI worked. So there's a bit of deception there. In the second study, we explained to people how humans and AI made the decision, but we explained it based on how AIs make the decision, which is looking at the similarity of different kinds of pixels in photographs of malignant and benign moles. And so we found in both cases, people's subjective understanding for human and AI medical decisions went up, and their utilization of AI came closer to their utilization of human medical providers. And so what this means is it's not really about people actually understanding exactly how the AI works. It's more about their subjective perception that they understand. And so you don't necessarily have to explain to people exactly how these systems work. Ideally, you're going to do that in a truthful way for consumers because that's good business and that's a good practice when we're thinking about patients or any kind of ethical exchange with in a medical or other kind of business context. But what's important is really people's subjective understanding, and you may not have to explain it at a really deep level of detail. Enough, a very cursory kind of explanation may be enough. Like our last experiment in our most recent paper, we did a Google Ads study, and we showed about 14,000 people ads for Skin Vision, which is one kind of skin cancer detection application, which they can download on their smartphone, and they can take a picture of their skin, and it gives them an indication about whether or not they should see a dermatologist. And so in the controls situation, we just basically told them about Skin Vision, and we told them that it uses an algorithm to make decisions about whether or not their moles are cancerous or benign. In the treatment condition, we just basically told them that it looks at the color, shape, and size of moles when the AI is making this kind of decision. And that was enough. That kind of explanation, even though it was very cursory, was enough to boost click-through rates by almost twice. So we can see that people aren't immutable in terms of their reticence to embrace AI. They just need to feel like they understand it, and they just need to feel like it's taking into account all of their information. And that kind of comfort that a little more explanation can provide is really helpful. And so what we also found when we looked at different kinds of applications and how they were advertising themselves in the app stores is they're talking a lot about performance, because rightly, a lot of consumers are concerned about the performance of AI, but they're not explaining these other kinds of factors that seem to be really influential in whether or not people are willing to adopt these kinds of services or not.
I think that's a very important. I just wanted to highlight that part, that is these beliefs that people have, which as we mentioned before, they're kind of ironic, because oftentimes they represent quite a bit of departure of the of the reality of the facts and the most actually research and well-established benefits of AI. But these beliefs are not immutable and rigid, so they are malleable, and they can be corrected, and sometimes they don't even require that complicated of interventions. Another point that I wanted to highlight, in light of something that happened very recently, which is that we've been approached by the founder of an app which is called Healthily, which is a European app that is the first app that has reached the medical device status in Europe, which is basically like an initial triaging app used for delivering various types of healthcare services. And they approached us because they read our paper, which made us very, very happy. And they were what we wrote about this in this AI explainability paper resonated with them. So they decided to actually write a statement that would explain AI to their customers. And they explained in a non-technical language in terms of why do they use AI, what is the AI going to do? And we don't have data to speak to that, but I think it would be extremely interesting to see whether the mere provision of this kind of statement is helpful enough to, kind of abate somewhat the resistance that people have to use it. So what Carey said about the fact that it might not be necessary to go into the details and for people to fully understand the technicalities of how AI operates, but to have these surface level understanding of how an AI works might be enough for people to adopt it. So something that has emerged, and I thought it was really fascinating, and this is not just about, it's evident in these two papers that we talked about, but it's not limited to these two. And it's kind of like a comment that operates at a more abstract level, which is that it appears to me that what people begrudge or resent AI for presumably lacking is the very same thing that people seem to inflict to AI. And let me explain what I mean by that. So we mentioned before that one of the reasons why people resist AI is because of this fear of uniqueness neglect, which is basically the fear that AI is not going to see people for their variability and their heterogeneity and their uniqueness. And that is ironically what people also seem to inflict to AI. So for instance, that is evident in the fact that if we look at how people respond to AI in terms of things like likelihood of choice or preference, responses seems to be the same irrespective of the type of AI that people are considering. So people respond in the same way, whether they're thinking about a regression, whether they're thinking about a computer, whether they're thinking of adversarial machine learning. So irrespective of the level of sophistication, or the fact that these artificial intelligence systems might be different, people respond in the same way. So just like people fear that AI is going to be neglectful or their variability, they also seem to neglect AI's variability. And another effect that has emerged that speaks to this is that people seem to draw stronger inferences based on sparse observation of AI to a greater extent that they draw inferences based on sparse observation of human behavior. So for instance, what people learn about one AI, they assume to be true about different AIs to a greater extent than what people learn about one human, they seem to assume true about other people. So again, it's fascinating how just like we think that AI is going to be neglectful of our uniqueness, we are also in many ways neglectful of the fact that AI too is unique and can vary and can do so quite a bit.
I think I second what Chiara is saying in terms of our critique of AI as a species. Mm-hmm. And I would go further and say that like on what's come out of this research for me is that in many cases, people are actually pretty well calibrated in terms of their perception of AI, the fact that they don't recognize how it works, that it's a new technology, they perceive some risk there. I think that's rational in some ways. What's irrational and what seems to cause a lot of their aversion to AI seems to be the really benevolent way that we treat other humans, right? We assume our doctor is going to think about all of our conditions when they're making a decision. We believe that we understand how the doctor makes decisions, even when we have no idea. And so in many cases, I see the aversion to AI as not necessarily an aversion to AI, that we may be calibrated in how we feel about AI, but that we're overly welcoming of human care, human decision-making in our lives, and that we think that humans are more accurate than they actually are. And so that, I think that's one feature of it. And the second thing that was really surprising that came out of the research for me was that what we find is that people, these kinds of hesitations mostly come up when people are making sort of outsourcing their own choices to AI, but we don't see these kinds of hesitations when they're outsourcing these decisions to AI for other people. So if we ask people, how likely should an average patient rely on this kind of medical recommendation, people think that the patient should rely on the medical recommendation of an AI as much as they should a human doctor. And so what's important about that is that most of the people who are developing AI software and most of the people who are rolling this out in healthcare systems or firms thinking about whether to invest or not, are thinking about the adoption of AI as like, this is a system that patients will adopt. And so they're not thinking about themselves, would I adopt this system? And so a lot of these kinds of things that we're exploring, these psychological barriers to the adoption of AI, may be invisible to them because their perspective is on patients as a group rather than thinking about themselves. So in one way, firms and developers can learn a lot about, what are some of these kinds of barriers by shifting their perspective and thinking about themselves as the patient before they roll out different kinds of programs, to think about, what are patients going to be hesitant towards, what kinds of things we need to explain, what's going to be a satisfying experience for them, and what's going to make this new kind of experience more acceptable to them and seem less risky.